despite all of the perceptions. One of the best places you can get the highest returns is in Nigeria.
Back in 2019, during a World Bank meeting, Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, disclosed to journalists that Nigeria was struggling to service its debt. Her purpose of saying this being that she was trying to justify taking another trillion naira loan that would take Nigeria's debt that stood at over 25 trillion naira to something close to 27 trillion naira. Why this amount of money seems huge to you? The amount of money Nigeria owes is nothing compared to what the likes of France, the United States, or even the United Kingdom owe. In fact, Nigeria is not even on the top 10 list of indebted countries in the world. But the major reason to why Nigeria's own debt stands out is because, according to a list released by the World Bank back in 2021 that contained countries with the highest debt exposure, Nigeria came 5th. For those who may not really understand the implications for a country to have high debt exposure, don't worry, I will explain. A country with high debt exposure is a country that owes so much money to the extent that it is not recommended that they borrow money again, simply because they won't be able to pay back, or there are high chances that if the country still goes on to borrow money again, they might end up getting into a debt crisis, which might be the situation Nigeria might have gotten itself into, with debt in the country currently hitting over 44 trillion naira, with some experts even saying the true worth of the country's debt stands at around 77 trillion naira. Now the question is, how did Nigeria get itself into this debt mess? Well, to find out, we need to go back in time to understand the history of Nigeria's borrowing. You see, Nigeria's debt profile could be traced back to the past decades, just before the independence of 1960. During this time period, our debt remained small or insignificant. But following the global economic downturn in the late 1970s, Nigeria raised its first $1 billion loan from the international capital market to finance infrastructure projects, and by 1979, just before Nigeria transitioned from the military leadership of Obasanjo to the civilian leadership of Shehu Shagari, we had a public foreign debt profile of around $3.744 billion. In 1982, a fall in oil prices then resulted in a massive borrowing by the Shehu Shagari administration from the international capital market, and this was done without any conscious attempt to address the main problem of the Nigerian economy, which was the overdependence of the country on oil exports. By 1983, the Shagari administration had driven Nigeria's debt to roughly $20 billion, and due to the widespread of corruption in the country during his era, the military had to overthrow his government. In 1986, the international community had pity on the bad economic situation of Nigeria, enabling Nigeria to then sign its first bilateral debt rescheduling, which involved a whopping $2.9 billion. Nigeria was now allowed to settle her debt within 6 years with an additional grace of around 2 years. While this debt rescheduling was very good for the Nigerian economy, it is important to know that between 1984 and 1999, Nigeria's external debt increased from $9 billion to over $30 billion, and this was majorly caused by the theft of most of these past military rulers, as most of them took loans to finance partially executed or completed projects. By 1999, as I said earlier, we had an external debt of around $30 billion, and this was the same year former military ruler Obasanjo took over of the government, but this time as a civilian ruler.
Do solemnly swear
that I will be faithful
that I will be faithful
and bear true allegiance
and bear true allegiance
to the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
to the Federal Republic.
One of the key priorities of Obasanjo's government was to reduce Nigeria's debt burden and improve its economic situation. To achieve this, the Obasanjo administration knew that they needed to implement a range of economic and financial reforms, including debt reduction and cancellation. One of the first steps they then took to achieve this was to negotiate a debt relief package with the Paris Club of Creditor Nations. For proper context, the Paris Club is an informal group of creditor nations which include the United States and other European countries that work together to provide debt relief to countries facing financial difficulties. And back then, Nigeria was facing a very big financial difficulty, so Obasanjo had to negotiate with the Paris Club for them to cancel over $18 billion of Nigerian debt in 2005. And by 2007, when Obasanjo had finished his reign as president, Nigeria owed only $2.11 billion in external debt actually, and 2.17 trillion naira in domestic debt, by also becoming one of the fastest growing countries in Africa. After Obasanjo had left power in 2007, Yar'Adua took over as the president of Nigeria. And one of the major milestones of the Yar'Adua administration in regards to Nigeria's debt is that in 2009, Nigeria became the first African country to fully repay its debt to the Paris Club of Creditor Nations. Yar'Adua's reign as the president of Nigeria was not actually filled with a lot of government borrowing, as even with the global financial crisis that happened in 2008, Nigeria only owed $3.5 billion in external debt and 5.6 trillion naira in domestic debt. In 2010, Goodluck Jonathan then took over as the president of Nigeria after the death of Yar'Adua. Similar to his predecessor, Goodluck Jonathan was bent on trying to manage the economy properly while also trying not to borrow a whole lot of money. But even with that, by 2015, when he had left power and President Buhari took over, Nigeria had an external debt of $6.45 billion and a domestic debt of around 7.9 trillion naira. This figure is not much compared to the figures that you'll be hearing after Jonathan had left power. In fact, you can call 2015 the year the king of all borrowers entered into power.
Do you want change in Delta State?
You see, in 2015, when President Buhari came into power, there was jubilation across the whole of Nigeria. Many Nigerians believed that a savior had come to save them from the economic and security woes of Goodluck Jonathan. After all, there was a whole lot of Boko Haram crisis in the country. The naira had gone from 156 naira per dollar during Yar'Adua's tenure to 158 naira per dollar during Jonathan's tenure, while the external and domestic debt had also gone from $3.5 billion and 5.69 trillion naira under Yar'Adua's tenure to $6.45 billion and 7.9 trillion naira, respectively, during Jonathan's tenure. So there was a need for change. Well, change was what our current president Buhari brought when he entered into power. His first 2 years in leadership were relatively stable, but by 2020, after the completion of his first 4 years as the president of Nigeria and serving a second term, Nigeria's external debt and domestic debt had already doubled. Fast forward to now in 2023, Buhari is about to leave office as the president and Nigeria owes $41.69 billion in external debt and 27.5 trillion naira in domestic debt. This excludes an additional domestic debt of 23.7 trillion naira that was gotten from the Central Bank of Nigeria through a strategy called Ways and Means. Reports are estimating that if the Ways and Means debt of Nigeria is included, Nigeria's total debt now would amount to $172 billion, representing around 35% of the current Nigerian GDP, which is mind-boggling. After hearing the history of Nigeria's debt, I'm certain that you'll be curious to find out what have been the major causes of the recent skyrocketing of Nigeria's debt. Well, the cause of Nigerian debt crisis can be categorized into two factors. One is the external factor, which has to do with things outside the control of the Nigerian government. An example of this is the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused an economic downturn globally. While the second one is internal factor, which has to do with the expensive spending of the Nigerian government. To really explain to you how external and internal factors have contributed to the country's debt crisis, Nigeria is heavily dependent on the export of oil, which accounts for more than 80% of its export earnings and about 60% of the government revenue. Now, due to the 2015 oil price crash, which is like an external factor, Nigeria's oil revenue dropped significantly, making the government not to have enough money to fund its expensive budget, which is something like an internal problem. They could have actually reduced the budget, but rather they went on to borrow money to fund this particular budget that was expensive. To then make the matter worse, Nigeria was also hit by a sharp drop in oil production due to militancy in the Niger Delta region, which disrupted oil exploration and production. This internal security problem further reduced the country's oil revenue, making it difficult for the government to finance its budget deficit. In response to this, the Buhari-led administration introduced a number of measures to increase non-oil revenue, including the introduction of new taxes and the expansion of the tax base. However, these measures have not generated enough money to offset the loss of the oil revenue, and the government has now been forced to borrow heavily to finance its spending. And as a result, Nigeria's debt has skyrocketed under Buhari, leading to concerns about Nigeria's debt sustainability. As every action has consequences, Nigeria's heavy borrowing has resulted in making the country spend 96% of its revenue on paying debt. This same debt crisis has also contributed to persistent inflation in the country, the devaluation of the naira, high taxation, high interest rates, and corruption and poverty in the country, making us ask, what is the solution? I am no economist, but doing research on this subject matter, I have come to understand that Nigeria suffers from a spending problem and corruption problem. And when you join these two together, you have theft. Yes, Nigeria suffers from theft and not debt. And from my own perspective, I believe that the solution would be the government cutting down on expenses and being frugal. There's so need for the government to diversify the economy from oil-based revenue to technology or tourism-based revenue. Furthermore, debt restructuring is something that the Debt Management Office of Nigeria should be considering as well. If you enjoyed this video, then you enjoy my video on the Chinese debt trap in Africa. Click on the card above on the end screen to go watch, and don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in Afrocentric business and finance content. Dewo.